In a few minutes, my colleague Charlotte will introduce you to our 6 wonderful panellists. And on behalf of Feedback, I'd like to express our deep gratitude to them all today for carving time out of their busy working week and coming to share their experience and wisdom with us here. But before handing over the floor, I'd like to say a few words about the ways in which women's livelihoods and people in coastal communities are impacted by fish farming. So today, more than half of the seafood produced and consumed worldwide is farmed. And although farmed fish is often presented as a sustainable, affordable, climate-friendly source of protein, which relieves pressure on fish populations in the wild, the way we've chosen to farm fish in many regions around the world poses serious social, ecological, and ethical concerns. And the problems that fish farming raises affect millions of people worldwide. One of the biggest problems that we've identified is what we at Feedback call the food feed competition that's driven by the production of farmed fish, such as salmon and sea bass, often for high income markets in Europe, Asia, North America. And this drives demand for wild fish such as sardines, sardinella and herring, which could otherwise be used to feed human beings directly. Every year, millions of tons of fish, roughly 1/5 of the world's marine catch, are ground up to make fish meal and fish oil for sectors such as salmon farming. And when I say millions of tons, just to put a figure on that, in 2018, 18 million tons of wild-caught fish were ground up to feed not only aquaculture, but also animal farming. Aquaculture now represents the bulk of that demand. So the practice of diverting wild-caught fish away from people and towards global aquafeed supply chains, effectively commoditizing food, not only deprives local fishermen and women of their catch, but it also disrupts local and regional food webs. And of course, it also has a big impact on marine ecosystems, including other fish species and marine birds and mammals. So over the past few years, we at Feedback have built up a compelling body of evidence on the damaging socio-ecological impacts of feed production for the fish farming sector and campaigned to reform aquaculture on the basis of this evidence. Last year, we published research with the universities of Cambridge, Liverpool and Lancaster, which shows that the way we feed farmed fish is not only a very inefficient way of producing protein, but it's also highly wasteful of vital micronutrients such as calcium and iron, which are essential to healthy brain development, particularly in babies, infants and children. And this is of major concern, particularly in regions of the world that suffer from poor food security and nutritional deficits, of course. We've also learned a lot about global fish meal and aquafeed supply chains, and more recently have launched a big programme of work with international partners in West Africa and in Europe, which is looking at the impact of the fish feed industry in this region. And you'll hear that West Africa is a very important hub for fish meal and fish oil production in some of today's presentations. What we're trying to do today is to provide a platform for a group of extremely talented women whose lived experience reflects some of the serious issues we've identified through our own research and campaigning. And by doing so, we want to make women's vital role in fisheries more visible and to show how their work is impacted by the growing global aquaculture industry. And we hope that many of you, including the politicians and decision makers among you, will be inspired by these stories and reflect on how you might use your own role to address some of the issues highlighted. Today's event has also been very deliberately structured to highlight the commonalities between communities thousands of miles apart, whose lives and livelihoods are being affected by a failure to make a multi-million-dollar industry accountable for its impact throughout its supply chain. And finally, we want you to come away from today's event inspired by what you've heard and fired up by the possibility of taking collective action for the better. And without further ado, I will hand you over to my colleague, Charlotte. Thank you.
Yeah, hello everyone. Also, a warm welcome from my side. I'm coordinating the project Our Fish that Natasha has just introduced. And I have the honor to now introduce you to Sally Ann Campbell from Scotland, our first speaker. Sally has worked as a marine ecologist across the UK and US and spent a number of years on the governing board of Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation, working for sustainable seas in inshore marine environments in Scotland. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I have a small presentation that is going to be put on. This tells you a little bit about my interests. My main interest is complexity, the state really in which many things come together, producing answers that are quite difficult for us to understand immediately. I live on the inshore waters of the west of Scotland, which has been overfished by dredging and trawling since the end of the 80s. But of particular interest to me is the salmon farms and their carbon footprints, and I'll come on to talk about some of these issues in a moment. Salmon nowadays, they make a great boast that they are salmon raised are 60% vegetarian, but you've got to remember that whereas they were 90% vegetarian, that was a much smaller biomass of salmon raised in fish farms. I've worked with the Scottish creel fishermen and sustainable fisheries, including creeling, which is often called potting in parts of the world, and diving, and working towards this reduction in bottom trawling. So we're actually looking at things like sustainable certifications. I have a great skepticism about all these labels and also the carbon footprint. But the key to all of this is getting communities involved. And on Arran, where we fish farms, we are sometimes called by the local fisheries people the vipers, because we keep coming back and having reasons why we shouldn't have fish farms in our community. And I think the other thing, the big question for us all, do we need salmon aquaculture if we manage our sea resources properly? Next, please. So complexity is everything affects everything. So the fishing for small fish and so on off the Gambia or Senegal actually affects what happens in our bay out here where there's a fish farm. And actually that in turn will affect the flights that take our fish when they're mature, if they get to that stage, around the world. So everything is interconnected. Next, please. This is a typical creel boat, and you see the creels or pots that very often are creel boats in the west of Scotland are 1 or 2 manned, or with women as well, but also they're probably under 10 meters. So they are quite small. They live in their communities, are very much part of their communities. And this is why it's so important that sustainable fishery, real sustainability, is actually achieved in the west of Scotland. Next, please. So what is this fisheries aquaculture? First of all, it's low capital costs, relatively. Fling a few nets out into the bay here, and you can maximize your short-term profit by not cleaning up its environmental impact. Food, feces, disease control chemicals are all just shed into our inshore water marine environment. And that really is not on. But the way they manage fish farms is they look at them individually. They don't look at the cumulative impact of all of these fish farms on our inshore waters. Sea lice, which are very small creatures, are a real problem. Crustaceans, they're the same as crabs and prawns and lobsters. So they shed their skeletons to grow. And the pesticides that they use to control these interfere with new shell growth. So they're a parasitic organism and a real problem for salmon farmers initially, but also now our wild salmon and our wild salmon in our rivers that used to be so plentiful, but are now much less so. I've talked about cumulative impact of waste, and there are some good films now of the awful state underneath these fish farms. But we do have a problem. The Scottish government wants to double the aquaculture biomass by 2030. But my real message is that never underestimate the power of us all coming together, just not individually on the Isle of Arran, but actually with the people in British Columbia, the people in Chile, and the people in the areas where their fish are being fished out in order to feed short-term profit for the multinational corporations. Next, please. Just to give you an idea, this is Scotland, and you can see we're at the very bottom with that arrow, and that is the Isle of Arran. There are 200 farms with a maximum biomass of 500 tons of salmon. And as you can see, they are scattered all up the west coast into Orkney and into Shetland, the two most northerly islands. There are 16 salmon farms in the Greater Clyde, which is around Arran and up into the sea lochs of the Clyde. Next, please. How much do we produce in Scotland? Well, over 200,000 tonnes in 2021. These are all open nets, no pollution control of feces or waste food or chemicals. The true cost, as I've said earlier, to wild fish and the wild coastal environment of producing this volume is something that we should not be celebrating. In the production cycle, about 25% of the fish died or were culled before they reached harvesting size. That's about 13.5 million farmed salmon, Atlantic salmon, prematurely dying. Now, if you think about that, what a waste of resources, especially salmon feed sources from around the world. Next, please. Just to give you an idea, this is the 16 salmon farms in the Clyde, and it gives you the tonnage that comes from the Scottish government about what their emissions were over 5 years. And the tonnage you can see of copper from the nets, zinc from feed, nitrogen, phosphorus, of course, mostly of that is from feces and from urine, which a lot of the urine, of course, will go straight into the water. And the total organic carbon is nearly 15,000 tonnes. Next, please. Just a little bit about sea lice cycle. You know, if you send a kid or child to primary school with chickenpox, it's quite likely the rest will catch it in the class because it spreads much more quickly with density. And so it is with these sea lice, these parasitic copepods. They're distributed widely in the ocean, but they concentrate in these large fish farms. And they cause enormous problems. And in fact, because they are crustaceans, the chemicals can in fact kill other crustaceans when it's secreted or let into the marine environment. Next, please. Next. Oh, this is just to illustrate that. The little on the left-hand side, those are small sea lice all around the mouth and the gills of a salmon, a farm salmon. And on the right, they cause these enormous lesions. So these lead to much higher mortality. And there is now enough evidence that there is a risk that sea lice from aquaculture negatively affects population of salmon and sea trout on the west of Scotland. But not only that, it actually is affecting their waste and so on, is affecting spawning areas for other fisheries. And we need to actually think about that for the longer term. Next, please. I am very aware of greenwashing. I've written quite a lot about greenwashing. Most of the certifications are about single farms or single production units for soya or fisheries or palm oil or whatever, not for the cumulative impact. And I think the best thing I can say about that is I had a friend in banking, and we were talking about certification. He said, like all management systems, if you tick the right boxes and you pay your money, you can actually get certified concrete life jackets. I think that's what we certify here. Next, please. If we look at the salmon and trout feed, we've talked about the fact that it used to be 90% fish. Now it's less, but because of the increase in farm salmon, we are still using much more fish meal than we did 40 years ago. And you can see, and you can look up some of the commodity brokers as to what is the content of salmon or trout feed. I think the interesting thing is that the British like their farm salmon fairly pink, but actually wild salmon are not very pink at all. And it's a bit like putting in this astaxanthin pigment and you can make it any color you want. It's just like painting your walls, really. Next, please. Food miles, carbon footprints. They are really important for us to think about. I started considering this when the krill situation came up in the Antarctic. And I thought, no, that's not right, bringing all this krill from Antarctica. And gradually, of course, as fish farming has grown, so the demand for fish and krill, soya, palm oil has increased. But so we've got this enormous footprint bringing it to Scotland. But then we have another enormous footprint that flies it all over the world to various markets. And I think there is a real issue about multinationals using ingredients that deprive people around the world in indigenous populations of their livelihood. Overfishing and corruption are also associated. Let's hope the new United Nations will actually cover some of this. But we need to fish sustainably locally. Excuse me. Minimize dredging and bottom trawling. Next, please. I've talked about citizen participation. This was Aaron. We fought fish farms on and off for years. It does make a difference. We need to actually get democracy in action. We need to take on politicians and these multinationals who think they are outside of every sort of cumulative need to look at what they're doing. Next, please. So my message really, we are in Scotland traditionally a fishing nation. So we've got an enormous length of coastline and a lot of islands. And salmon aquaculture arrived here on the West Coast 50 years ago. It was small, locally owned. Then gradually it got taken over by powerful multinationals. And these multinationals have no commitment to sustainability, real sustainability, not certified sustainability. Short-term profit is their aim, and they are off the west of Scotland very profitable. What we need to do is to return to a more productive and resource-sustainable fishing industry for the long-term viability of our coastal villages and our island communities, and indeed indigenous populations all around the coasts of the world. Next, please. Just so you can see where I come from, that's Lamlash with the mountains behind, and I write for Voice for Aaron. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Next, I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Sally. I'll just hand over to Charlotte to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sally, for this very insightful presentation. I'll now introduce you to Diaba Diop. Diaba is a fish processor from the fishing village Kaya in Senegal. And Diaba leads an organization for female fish processors who are currently fighting against a fish meal factory that opened in 2019 in the fishing village Kaya. And Diaba will be speaking in French. Floor is yours, Diaba.
Donc, je peux le faire. Donc, je vais faire la présentation. Donc, c'est Madame Diaba Diop. Je suis la présidente du réseau des femmes du Sénégal, le REFEPAS. Il regroupe aussi bien des femmes transformatrices, des femmes. Notre chef se trouve à Dakar et je suis actuellement à Dakar parce que mon unité de transformation se trouve. Donc, pour venir au sujet, j'ai fait ma présentation liée à l'impact des grands navires et aux usines et aux navires des usines de farine de poisson au niveau du Sénégal. Donc, mais avant de faire ma présentation, avant de parler de ça, je vais parler d'abord 2 à 4 phrases par rapport à notre structure. Ensuite, je viens faire l'importance des femmes dans le secteur de la pêche et de leur contribution socio-économique. Et en troisième position, je vais parler de l'impact de ces usines de farine de poisson et de ces grands navires étrangers, comment elle a impacté l'activité des femmes transformatrices. Et enfin, c'est des recommandations. Donc, pour ne pas tarder, je vais faire une brève présentation, quelques mots sur mon organisation. C'est une organisation qui, au Sénégal, pour que toujours on parle de l'autonomisation des femmes, c'est dans ce sens qu'on a créé ce réseau-là. Il regroupe aussi bien des femmes transformatrices et des femmes mariées. Donc, pour être membre à cette fédération, il faut que tu sois que tu as un organisme dans les 5 grandes fédérations, se trouve au minimum dans les zones de cette région maritime au niveau du Sénégal. Donc, au niveau du Sénégal, les organisations qui sont membres à mon réseau, c'est la FENAGPES, la Fédération des GIE de pêche, la FENATRAM, FENAMS, l'INAGEM et le collectif national pour le développement des mareyeurs, et qui est ouverte à toutes les autres organisations qui veulent s'inscrire. Donc, notre objectif, c'est de participer au renforcement de la coopération entre les femmes, de la pêche artisanale, mais aussi maximiser la participation des femmes dans le secteur de la pêche, contribuer au renforcement des capacités organisationnelles, professionnelles, politiques et économiques. Donc, notre organisation est membre du réseau des femmes africaines de la pêche. Donc, nous sommes présents dans toutes les zones de pêche, dans la chaîne de valeur, de la cueillette à la vente. Donc, les femmes occupent une place très importante. Donc, dans le secteur de la pêche, plus de 50% dans le secteur, c'est des femmes. Et nous sommes présents au niveau de la conservation de la biodiversité, nous sommes au niveau de la transformation, comme au niveau du mariage. Et tout le monde sait que si on revient au contexte de la pêche artisanale au Sénégal, donc la pêche crée des emplois, création de recherche, création d'emplois. Et pour la recherche, nous, en tant que femmes transformatrices, tout ce que nous tirons de cette activité est destiné à payer l'éducation de nos enfants, à participer à la dépense quotidienne au sein de la famille. Donc, et même une étude, nous l'avons faite pour montrer que l'importance des femmes que nous jouons dans le secteur de la pêche. Donc, tout ce que nous gagnons, il y a plus de 65%, il y a plus de 35% qui est destiné aux dépenses quotidiennes, 65% qui est destiné à payer les scolarités de nos enfants, et aussi pour participer à la location de nos au sein de la famille. Donc, il y avait plus de 45%. Donc, pour revenir par rapport aux usines de farine de poisson et à la présence des navires étrangers au niveau du Sénégal, cela impacte l'activité que nous faisons. Si je prends l'activité de la pêche, donc pour le pêcheur, avec la forte présence de ces usines de farine de poisson et de ces navires étrangers, favorise la mauvaise pêche et les mauvaises pratiques. Ça favorise aussi le fait d'aller dans des zones interdites pour la pêche artisanale, utiliser des mauvaises pratiques, mais aussi faire beaucoup de temps pour aller pêcher dans les zones les plus reculées. Donc, pour ce qui concerne nous, en tant que femmes transformatrices, l'accès à la ressource est difficile. Donc, le petit pélagique qui est destiné à faire de la transformation, donc, qui connaissait petit pélagique au Sénégal, est destiné à la transformation, comme les sardinaires rondes et les sardinaires plats, les maquereaux, les chanchards, etc. Donc, c'était destiné à la transformation. Mais actuellement, l'accès pour les femmes est difficile parce que ce type d'espèce est destiné actuellement à non seulement à l'exportation, mais c'est destiné actuellement à la fabrication de l'huile et de farine de poisson. Parce qu'il y avait la forte concurrence entre nous, en tant que femmes transformatrices, et les usines de farine de poisson. Donc, cela impacte le travail des femmes transformatrices. Comment? Il y avait une baisse drastique de la production des femmes et la baisse de la chiffre d'affaires des femmes. Donc, les femmes ne parviennent plus à assurer, à payer les scolarités de leurs enfants, ni à assurer la dépense quotidienne au sein de la
Merci beaucoup, Diaba. Nous allons être contraintes de passer au prochain présentateur à cause du temps. Le temps passe vite. Donc, est-ce que vous pouvez vous en tenir là et puis on peut reprendre la discussion pendant la session des questions.
C'est quelque chose à faire, mais
Très bien. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Diaba.
Yes, thank you very much,
okay.
Diaba.
Yes.
I'll now introduce you to Fatou Ejeng. Fatou works as a fish seller in the Gambia and also currently studies aquaculture and works for an environmental organization called the Gambian Environmental Alliance. And the floor is yours, Fatou.
I am Fatou Ejeng from the Gambia, and I am a member of the Gambia Environmental Alliance. I am a fish seller and also a student at the university in the Gambia studying agricultural science, general agricultural science. As a fish seller, I have started that noble job in the past 23 years when I was in the age of 20. And actually, it is a noble job, which I can say, because selling fish has no losses. Because you directly benefit from what we are selling, that is having the food directly. And at the same time, selling it to your fellow Gambian or fellow people who benefit from fish. As you can see, fish is a good protein to every human being. And in Africa, food is the main source of food that every Gambian needs when they go to the market to buy food for their family. And looking at the job we are doing, compare yesterday and today, or before and now, actually, before it used to be a very noble job. It used to be a very noble job that we benefit a lot from it. That in those days, we sell fish, we have our daily expenditures in the house, we pay our children's school fees from what we're selling, we pay our house rent, our bills from what we sell. And actually, we really enjoy it in those days, actually. But compared to now, here in the Gambia, is a big problem, I can say, because my fellow women are really suffering. When we get to the riverside to buy this fish to go and take it to our community for business to sell it to them, is a big challenge to us. Looking at our fish mills now that are occupying in our country, in the Gambia, as I can say, it really interrupts our business a little bit. Not a little bit, but it really discourages us as being a woman fish seller. Because now look at all the good fishes now are now given to the fish mills, shell to the fish mills. We just take the remaining. And looking at the remaining, the amount attached to the remaining is very high compared to before. Before, I can just say, when we buy a big basin of fish for $50, $2,500. Now we're gonna buy that one for $8,000, which is equivalent to $130. And guess what? When you buy that, take it to the market. You will sell a whole day and that basin will not be finished. It is a big challenge to us. Spending your $130 or $8,000 to buy one basin of fish. You sell a whole day and you only realize that you can sell halfway of that basin you have bought from the river. Actually, is discouraging. What are we going to do with the remaining? We add more additional costs on it. By how? We buy ice block. When we buy ice block, we have to provide our own cold store for those fish to be kept for the next day to continue our business. Buying the ice block, which is very expensive, actually disturbs us a lot. The other angle you see here, I'm sitting with the woman, is my fellow co-worker, I can say. When we went to the beach, we realized that these fish are all rotting fish. They are not good to consume directly, unless and until we put another preservation method that we can use it. We buy those basins for $5,000 or $6,000. We go and buy salt to make it a salt fish. Apply the salt on it, dry it for almost 3 or 4 days. Then after drying it, that's the time we collect those salted fish and sell them to the market, which is also another hectic job for us, because looking at all these things definitely is too stressful. When we take it to the market, it's also another problem. Sometimes for you to finish that one you have dried for a week is a problem. At the end of the day, you realize losses. You realize that you have put in an amount that you don't get again, which is really discouraging. Where I have just been explaining, that is buying the ice block at the same spot, putting it in the fish, put it in the local freezers where we're going to put our padlock in those freezers. When we leave it behind, go back home to relax, enjoy ourselves so that we can prepare the next day to come to the market and sell the remaining fish. We normally find intruders, thieves, collect all our fish, take it along. What do we realize? Losses. After buying a basin of fish for $8,000, you sell around $2,000, $3,000. The leftover, you keep it for the next day to continue your business, and the intruders in your absence collect everything. A big crime for all my fellow fish sellers in our community. The community I am selling fish right now is called Ibo Town in Serakunda, KMC, Kanifing Municipality. Actually, most of my fellow women discouraged and leave the noble job. They leave it totally because they don't have capital again to start. When it happens to you like the way I explained, they will not have capital to start the business again. So they prefer to go and look for other things, other angles. And guess what? Their children will be dropped out. They will not have enough food to eat. So we struggle, continue the same strategy again, go and take other loans or other gather money on other areas, get back to the river, to the sea, collect those basins from them. Now we say, let us use another method. What is that method? When we collect it, we sell it to the Chinese people within our vicinity. At Bunju, we have a Chinese fish mill. So when we prefer to sell it to them, they also put heavy loads on our heads because they actually know that we don't have any other choice. Now they prefer to buy those bases of fish from us in a very low price. And if you don't have any other action, if you are running away from going to the market, selling it there and it will not finish, you prefer to give it to them. Continue with another method again. Most of my fellow fish sellers are having loan debts with the credit from either the government or private sectors or neighbors or relatives. Because what they depend on is their fish selling. Shellfish at the end of the day brings you a lot of stress, lot of constraints, actually is a problem. That's why we Gambia, we are saying, where is our fish? Where is our fish? Where can we get our fish? Who can help us to get our fish? These are the questions that we are putting on board to any prostators, any sector, anywhere we go. Yet still, we cannot say we are not going to sell fish. We have to sell fish for the benefit of the community, for our own benefit, because every day, actually, no matter how difficult it is, people like me collect from the fish I shell and take it to my family so that they can have delicious food. Gambia, we are known of fish. When there is no fish in the market, what our local community normally said, how is the market today? Is it nice? They say, Marse is not nice today. That means there is no enough fish, or fish are more expensive today. So fish is our daily needs. Being the poor or the rich in the Gambia, I'm saying, is our daily needs. We really find it very, very difficult in the riverside to have fish that we really think can benefit us and benefit the community. And yet still, we will never be discouraged. We will also never relent, because this is our job. And it's a noble job, because as women, I always feel happy when they say International Women Day. I said, we are heroines. We spend whole day, early morning we went to the beach side, collect the fish, take it to the market, sell. After selling, store it, get back home, prepare for the next day. It means it's a whole day job, very hectic, very stressful. So actually, definitely, these are real constraints that I and my fellow fisheries are facing in our community, not only my community, but all other community in the Gambia. They're facing the same thing. We never compare before and now today. Before used to be a day of celebration. You go to shell, at the end of the day, you come back home, smile fish, no stress. Your children feel comfortable. Their education progress. Your own problems being solved within your own corner of your house. But now problems are spread out. You have to go helter shelter, looking for where to settle them. And actually, as women fish seller, that's where we depend all our hopes. That's where we place all our eggs. All the eggs are put in that basket. Actually, if we don't have support, if the government did not step in, if others outside did not come to our aid, we, the fish sellers, might suffer more and more and more, and we don't know where it will take us to. So actually, this is what I have to present today, and I am saying thank you to everybody, and thank you to the moderator giving me the opportunity to be here with the team. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, Fatou, for your very interesting presentation. Our next speaker is going to be Manjula Gulliksen from Sweden. A warm welcome. Manjula is a fisherwoman working in a small-scale fishing community in Sweden. A history of over 500 years of herring fishing, but is now suffering from remarkably decreasing fish population.
Mitt namn är Manjula Gulliksen och jag är en yrkesfiskare från Sverige som bedriver småskaligt fiske längs Bottenhavskusten. Jag äger och driver min gårdsbutik som ligger i anslutning till min bostad. Och i butiken kan ni se mig filea, bereda, röka och sälja fisken direkt till kunden. Den fisk som fångas med min enkla utrustning bestående av nät och fällor är strömming, sik, lax, öring och abborre. När jag började 2004 var det många som var skeptiska om jag skulle klara av det. Och det fanns en hel del åsikter. Men jag bevisade att de hade fel. Idag är jag precis vilken annan yrkesfiskare som helst. Något som stör mig är att här längs Bottenhavskusten har strömmingen varit en bas i det kustnära fisket i flera hundra år. Picture 1. Så såg bilden ut. Så såg fångsten ut tidigare. Och vad man nu har märkt på senare år är att fångsten av strömmingen nästan uteblivit i förhållande till tidigare. Slice 2. Så ser näten ut idag. Men samtidigt under de senaste 12 åren har mängden och storleken på landningar, kvoter från intensivfiske varit flerfaldigt större än någonsin tidigare i fiskets historia här i Bottenhavet. Det är en stor avvikelse från det system som har bevisats fungera i det kustnära fisket under flera hundra år utan några bekymmer. Av den svenska strömmingskvoten som fiskas upp i Bottenhavet går mer än 99% till fiskmjölsindustrin. Påverkan av detta förter sig på olika sätt. I och med att jag bedriver min verksamhet i ett mindre samhälle blir också min kundbas väldigt specifikt inriktad på lokalbefolkningen runt omkring mig. Därför är det inte roligt att behöva göra folk nära och kära besvikna när de inte kan få sina leveranser från mig. Själv tappar jag trogna kunder och det tappar en vara som brukar finnas på middagsborden hos dem under flera högtider i Sverige. Utöver det går ekonomin ner kraftigt och den populära varan inte längre finns i en sortiment. Men många har svårt att förstå detta eftersom många äldre är vana att strömmingen alltid har funnits längs kusten och varit en viktig födokälla under svåra tider. Nu är det inte längre möjligt att fiska några större mängder för det kustnära fisket till lokal försörjning. Det jag ser som en lösning är att helt enkelt minska fiskekvoterna drastiskt och låta populationen återhämta sig. Detta är något som EU måste införa, det som har sista ordet. Jag har faktiskt gjort flera försök till att få detta att inträffa. Men så länge har det inte givit någonting. Ändå har jag fått flera politiska besök. Jag har skrivit till politiker, jag uttalar mig i media och vi har skrivit till och med direkt till EU. Tyvärr verkar ingen ta situationen på allvar. Det här problemet handlar inte bara om mig och min situation, utan framtiden för fisken, arten, miljön och framförallt ekosystemet. Då strömmingen fungerar som en basfisk i Bottenhavets ekosystem spelar den arten en väldigt viktig roll för balanserat ekosystem. Dess avsaknad och påföljande konsekvenser märks markant, då det även drabbar uppkomsten av andra fiskarter. Populationen av varje fiskart blir mindre eller alldeles för stor för ett hälsosamt ekosystem. Det komplexa och invecklade systemet blir rubbat. Vi har haft problem med gråsäl i vårt fiske, men det man kan se nu är allt ofta utsvultna sälar, bild slice number 3, som inte ens har ett tillräckligt tjockt späcklager för att kunna överleva på grund av brist på mat. Hur än det är vill man inte se djur plågas. Svenska regeringen och myndigheter hänvisar hela tiden till EU om fiskekvoterna och EU hänvisar i sin tur till internationella forskningsrådet ICES, vars råd uppenbart inte fungerar för kustfisket och ekosystemet. Det känns lönlöst när man får den sortens respons eller ännu mer ingen respons alls. Samtidigt kommer jag att vilja hålla hoppet uppe för att få bukt på problemet till slut. Jag kommer inte ge mig för regeringen, myndigheterna eller EU slutar sätta kvoter som inte fungerar för fiskens framtid och för det småskaliga fisket. Min viktigaste tanke, är det meningen att man ska efterlämna detta problem till våra barn och kommande generationer? Tack så mycket.
Very much, Manjula.
Tack så mycket, Manjula.
I will now introduce
Och nu
our
ska
last
jag...
speaker, Elsa McLellan. Elsa is a marine scientist and oyster farmer based in Scotland. She has worked in marine conservation organizations, Wild Salmon Trust, and policymaking bodies. She also campaigns for urgent change in Scotland's fishery management. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for asking me to speak today. I live in Ullapool, which is a village in northwest Scotland that was built to service the herring industry. But like many villages around Scotland's coast, fishing is no longer a mainstay of our economy, and that is in large part due to bad fisheries management. I'll be speaking about fisheries as well as aquaculture because one impacts the other, and it shows the bigger picture of how our government is incapable of managing our inshore waters. So I started with that lovely picture of healthy seabed because I'm afraid my presentation all goes downhill from here, but we have to remember that there is hope. And if any of my statements seem bonkers, which they will, because the whole situation is bonkers in Scotland, then please get in touch and I will provide source material. Could I have slide 2, please? There's so many issues with salmon farming that it's hard to summarise in the time I've got. So I'll just have a few. That's the view out of my window over a fish farm. There are huge welfare issues. I used to audit the fish farms for one of the standards that Sally mentioned, and I concur that I don't believe we made a single difference to fish welfare. Mass mortalities of over 50% of the fish per cycle are not uncommon, and figures last week indicate the mortalities doubled last year. As Sally's already said, fish farms use vast quantities of chemicals, including organophosphates, to try and keep their fish alive. These chemicals poison our environment, and because they target sea lice, which are a crustacean, they also impact wild crustaceans like prawns, lobsters, and crabs that are the mainstay for our coastal fishermen. The salmon farms target wild wrasse, which are a wee fish that eats the lice from their salmon. These wrasse are ecosystem engineers integral to the health of the rocky reef habitat that supports many species in our coastal waters, but nobody's bothered examining the potential impacts of moving these fish before they fish them out. And fish farms release, again, like Sally said, vast amounts of nitrate and phosphate into the sea, which the industry euphemistically call nutrient enrichment, though a nutrient at too high a dose is better defined as a poison. So despite making huge profits, it seems unlikely the industry will improve if left to their own devices because they commonly just do what they want until they're forced to stop, and they call that adaptive management. For example, they shot seals and used acoustic deterrent devices to scare seals, which we know impact whales, dolphins, until our government told them to stop that last year. The industry continued to lobby to be allowed to do both again. I live above that salmon farm in the picture. It's held afloat on blocks of polystyrene, which have been molting into the sea for over 40 years. The fish farm has repeatedly said that they'll remedy this, but no one has forced them to, so they haven't bothered. Slide 3, please. The Scottish Government know that salmon farming causes issue. In 2018, they held 2 inquiries into the industry. They took evidence from campaigners, scientists, and salmon farmers. The aim was to investigate the impacts and to identify opportunities. And their findings highlighted concerns over impacts. They stated that fish mortality was at unacceptable levels and that our marine ecosystem in Scotland faces irrecoverable damage from salmon farming if they don't sort themselves out. So the report concluded that the status quo is not an option and called for a precautionary approach to expansion. Unbelievably, despite these fundings, our government is vocal in its support for this industry, and they want it to double by 2030, basically doubling what we have in Scotland right now. The main argument for salmon farming seems to be economic, and they do employ people. I have worked for a salmon farm. A lot of my friends have or still do. Some of the jobs are nice and have prospects, but many don't. The fish farm I worked for never, and still doesn't, have automatic feeders, so it's some people's jobs just to chuck pellets at salmon all day long, which is not great for your morale or your carpal tunnel. Unsurprisingly, staff turnover is really high, so these are not jobs that are valuable or that people want to do. There is also the food for people argument, but it would be interesting to know how much food has been lost in the form of our once abundant wild salmon, the crustaceans that are being killed by the sea lice medication, whatever is being lost as a result of habitat degradation, and of course the fish from all over the world that are being caught and milled for salmon food. So quickly on to fisheries now, slide 4 please. Until 1984, bottom trawling was not allowed within 3 miles of Scotland's shore. This limit was put in place 100 years before because people understood even then that this newfangled trawling method was damaging. The limit was removed because fishermen lobbied to access these rich inshore feeding grounds, and the government couldn't police it anyway. So you can see from these graphs and the development of the scallop dredging industry. Scallop dredging is the most damaging fishery we have in the UK, which developed coming into the 1980s, has been devastating for fish stocks, as the graphs show. These graphs are from the Clyde, but what happened in the Clyde is a microcosm of what happened right the way around Scotland's coast. It's been devastating for communities and biodiversity. Trawling and dredging scrape the seabed, grinding 3-dimensional habitats flat, and they impact anything that can't get out of the way. They also have high levels of bycatch. Can I have the next slide, please? We have other ways of catching shellfish that have far less collateral damage, like the baited creels that Sally mentioned, and hand diving. And in fact, most of our fishermen, over 74% of Scotland, fish with creels, but the government do not incentivise this choice, and there is understandably a lot.
Le gouvernement semble ignorer effectivement le problème. Mais le problème, effectivement.
Again, the government's done their homework, but they haven't acted on it. Their own studies state that a coastal limit on trawling and dredging would bring more jobs and more money alongside environmental recovery. And their website states that our seabed carbon sinks, in particular marine mud, they absorb more carbon than all of Scotland's peats, soils and forestry combined. Our politicians, who are master greenwashers, if nothing else, say that 37% of our inshore waters are marine protected areas, but these designations mean nothing because many of the areas have no protective measures in place at all, and those that do continue to be fished illegally. We have limited policing here and the penalties are low. The fact is that in Scotland, less than 5% of our inshore seabed has legal protection from scallop dredging, which devastates habitats, including carbon sinks. All of Scotland's inshore fishermen are now relying on shellfish to make a living. There are no finfish fisheries left. This is a result of fishing down the food chain, and it is a terrible indictment of our fisheries management. The fact that we don't even have management plans for most of the shellfish stocks left shows that we've learned nothing. So despite the mass mortalities from farmed salmon, that industry now makes more money for the Scottish economy than all of our fisheries, which I find incredibly depressing. So the buck stops with the Scottish government. Yes, they consult and they commission reports and studies, but they don't have the will or the bravery to act on their findings. And if we want to see recovery of fish stocks and the environment, we have to manage the damaging fisheries and industries throughout the inshore, and not just on these wee remnant patches that they draw on a chart. I'm really ashamed that the impact of decisions made here are having a detrimental impact, not just here, but on people and countries all over the world. Next slide, please. So just to end, another wee bit of hope. These are pictures from my current employer of us restoring marine habitats. We are trying to restore native oysters and seagrass. And I do believe there's hope. If we all work together, we can make a positive difference. Thank you very much for listening to me.
For the very insightful presentation. Thank you. Then I'll hand over to Tiggy.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Thank you to all of our presenters and to everybody. This is the first multilingual online event we've hosted, so I appreciate everyone's patience as we figure out how to make sure that all of the languages are going to the right places. Definitely some things we've learned from this experience that we'll carry on to our next event. Now, we are going to be moving on to the question and answer section. So maybe I can have all of the panelists up here with me and we can get into a small discussion. We do have one question that's been submitted to us so far, and maybe I'll read it out loud, and panelists, as you're comfortable, maybe raise your hand and you can weigh in on the question. So Jill Bird asks, what effect would establishing the international law of ecocide have on these ocean abuses and greed? And for those in the audience who may not be familiar, this is basically asking what would it be to have a legal basis to punish people, potentially imprison them or fine them on the basis of knowingly harming the environment or carrying out activities that harm the environment. Does any one of our panelists want to weigh in on this first?
I think there is a big issue, Elsa discussed it, about Scotland, which is compliance. You know, we need a large body of opinion that actually says who is going to make these large multinationals who have devious ways of doing things actually comply with the law and actually look at cumulative impacts before they can be licensed to take fish or whatever from wherever. There is a real problem in Scotland about compliance. And I think that is certainly when I was looking and writing my last paper, and I was looking at Senegal and this huge trawler that was seen to had been owned in various places according to where they wanted to take their fish feed. It makes it very difficult for the northwest of Africa nations to actually keep their own fish. And we've heard the stories of fish meal being prepared and brought to Scotland. And I think that there is this commoditization of fish, as with soya and with palm oil, that actually leaves indigenous people and people who depend upon those environments without support from international bodies. So the ENGOs have got to pull their thumb out much harder and actually track what's happening, whether it be in Antarctica or whether it be in the northwest of Africa, as to what is actually happening to these fish.
Thank you so much, Sally. I just want to build off of that question and pose something to some of our panelists that have actually worked in these fisheries and fished themselves, either selling or actually on boats. Do you think there can be a future where both industrial fishing and small-scale fishing exists?
Kvoterna måste ju sänkas, anser jag. Det är jätteviktigt. Och nu kan vi industririsikerna jobba också, men det jag anser som är väldigt viktigt, det är ju att kvoterna ska sänkas för att vi små kustfiskare ska kunna vara kvar.
Thank you, Manuela. What about Fatu and Elsa, if we hear from you?
As you can all hear my testimony, that is the problem that we are facing as of now. So we actually need to apply laws which can support Africans, because I think this problem is more in Africa here. So if laws are applied, and those laws can change the living condition or the living condition the human sailors are facing. But if there is no law, it means these fish meals will continue in our country. And when they continue in the country, it means we are not going to get what we need at the end of the day. Because as you can see, it is too expensive because those people are over there, they can buy it at any price. But for we, the poor sellers, we cannot buy it with the price. So if laws are applied, maybe those laws can support us, we, the poor people in the Gambia, so that our business can continue and life can be better for us. So this is the only thing that I want to contribute, and we need support from all angles so that at least things can change in our own side as fish sellers.
Thank you, Fatu. There was a question in the chat about some recent legislation in the UN, and I would like to pose the question to the panel about what they feel the role of legislation plays in solving some of the issues that you have talked about in your presentations?
The first thing we all have to work towards is to get ratification from all the countries who say they will participate without backsliding, because we know how business backslides. I think communities across the world need to work together. You know, we can't do it in isolation. So we all need to work together and use some of the NGOs to actually bolster that, to get us going, because we can't wait another 20 years.
Sally, you're absolutely right. Communities do need to come together and work together. And I hope a meeting like this, where we heard perspectives from all over the world, is just the beginning of a long and beautiful partnership and collaboration with different fishing communities from all over the world. I see that we are coming up against the end of this meeting, so I just want to take this time to thank everybody that has been involved. Thank you, all of our attendees. Thank you, our panelists and our interpreters. Thank you also for your patience as we figure out how to facilitate this sort of global collaboration via multilingual events. And thank you to my lovely colleagues at Feedback who worked very hard to put this event together. We will be sending a follow-up email to everybody that signed up with the recording of this event, as well as information on all of our speakers and where you can find either their writing or their work if you want to get in contact with them. So please watch out for that. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everyone.